For nearly 2 decades, American naval architects had been forced to build warships around political restrictions rather than battlefield realities. Then came World War II, and with it the collapse of the naval treaty system, which in turn allowed the United States Navy to finally design the heavy cruiser it had always desired. That ship turned out to be USS Baltimore, a warship that would perfectly embody America's transition to industrial and naval supremacy. Work on Baltimore's design began shortly after the outbreak of war in September of 1939. U.S. designers had long realized that they simply could not get the ship that they sought while sticking to the arbitrary 10,000-ton treaty limit. Thus, while retaining a similar overall layout and armor scheme to that of her direct predecessor USS Wichita, Baltimore's design incorporated a longer hull and a greater displacement, which improved her freeboard and stability. This prevented her from being top-heavy, which was a problem Wichita faced during the second half of World War II from all of the additional radar equipment and anti-aircraft weapons that had been added to that point. Baltimore's design also drew heavily from the Cleveland-class light cruiser design, several of which were already under construction at the time. Even though the two classes appeared similar from a distance, it was actually inside their hulls where they were the most similar, as Baltimore utilized a similar layout for her machinery spaces. Overall, Baltimore was 673 feet long, 70 feet wide, and displaced about 13,600 tons. She carried a main battery of 9 8-inch 55 caliber guns, which were housed in 3 triple turrets that were arranged in the typical heavy cruiser 2-in-1 layout. At max elevation, they could hurl a 335-pound projectile over 30,000 yards. Her secondary battery consisted of 12 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns that were housed in 6 enclosed twin mounts. Her light anti-aircraft battery at the time of her commissioning consisted of 12 quadruple 40mm Bofors mounts and 24 single-mounted 20mm Oerlikons. As I mentioned earlier, Wichita's armor scheme was carried over to Baltimore. Her main armor belt was 6 inches thick, and her deck armor was 2.5 inches thick. Her main battery turrets were protected by 8-inch faceplates, and over 6 inches of armor protected her barbettes and conning tower. Rated for 120,000 shaft horsepower, she had a top speed of 33 knots and a cruising range of 10,000 nautical miles at 15 knots. Baltimore's keel was laid down on May 26, 1941 in Quincy, Massachusetts by the Four River Shipyard, and she was launched in late July of 1942. She was commissioned into the United States Navy on April 15, 1943, with Captain William C. Calhoun in command. After conducting her shakedown cruise off Trinidad during July and her post-shakedown availability period in August, she sailed for the Pacific Theater in September. Baltimore saw her first action during the amphibious landings at Makin Atoll on November 20, 1943. Over the course of that day, she sent 1,350 rounds of 5-inch and 8-inch gunfire toward the atoll in support of the 27th Infantry Division's efforts to capture it. Once Macon was secured, Baltimore took up station with Carrier Task Group 50.1. She subsequently supported the group over the next several weeks, which included airstrikes in the nearby Marshall Islands during early December. In early January of 1944, Baltimore was assigned to Task Group 58.4 of the newly created Task Force 58. Her group got underway on January 19th for operations in the Marshall Islands, which began with carrier strikes on the 29th. Over the next week, her group supported the landings at Kwajalein and Roy Namur and struck Eniwetok Atoll as well. Baltimore was reassigned to Task Group 58.2 and supported the airstrikes that destroyed enemy shipping inside Truk Atoll on February 17th and 18th during Operation Hailstone. On the 17th, Lieutenant Junior Grade Denver M. Baxter, who was flying one of Baltimore's Kingfisher float planes, made a daring rescue while under fire of a downed F-6F pilot inside Truk Lagoon. She then supported strikes on the Palau Islands in late March, which were promptly followed by strikes on the Caroline Islands a few days later. In mid-April, Baltimore's task group ventured into the South Pacific and provided air cover for the landings at Hollandia on the northern coast of New Guinea. Afterwards, Truk was worked over again between April 29th and May 1st. While her task group's aviators were hitting Truk on April 30th, Baltimore shelled Japanese positions inside Satawan Atoll. The following day, one of her Kingfishers provided gunfire spotting for the battleship North Carolina, after the battleship's own Kingfishers had been lost the previous day during the daring rescue of 10 downed pilots by Lieutenant John Burns. Next up was Marcus Island, which her task group's pilots pounded on May 19th and 20th. This was followed by strikes on Wake Island on the 24th. In early June, she headed for the Marianas and screened the carriers as their planes rocked Guam and Rota between the 11th and 13th of June, which was then followed by strikes on Iwo Jima and Chichijima on the 15th and 16th. After the conclusion of the Battle of the Philippine Sea, she was dispatched to the Mare Island Navy Yard for a brief overhaul. Upon the completion of this overhaul, Baltimore got underway for San Diego, where on July 21st she embarked President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his entourage. She then steamed to Hawaii so that the president could confer with General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester W. Nimitz about the direction of the war in the Pacific. President Roosevelt re-embarked Baltimore on July 29th, and the heavy cruiser got underway for a tour of Alaskan waters. After transporting the chief executive to the Alaskan Territory, Baltimore headed for Mare Island for a more extensive overhaul and refit. Baltimore rejoined the Fast Carrier Task Force at Ulithi in mid-November, but didn't sortie with her task group until December 10th. She spent the rest of December supporting carrier strikes against Japanese positions on Luzon. On the 17th and 18th of the month, she endured Typhoon Cobra. She suffered damage to both of her float planes, 2 whaleboats, and had several of her 40mm and 20mm gun barrels bent. Somewhat more concerning, though, was the fact that some of her forward deck plates buckled, but thankfully she didn't lose her bow like her sister Pittsburgh would in a June 1945 storm. After briefly returning to Ulithi for repairs, Baltimore's task group struck Japanese targets on Formosa on the 3rd and 4th of January, and Luzon between the 6th and the 8th as the invasion of Lingayen Gulf got underway. On the 9th, the Fast Carrier Task Force entered the South China Sea through the Bashi Channel and hammered targets throughout the area over the next 2 weeks. She then supported carrier strikes against the Greater Tokyo area on February 16th and 17th, before supporting the invasion of Iwo Jima from February 19th to March 5th. Over the next several months, Baltimore alternated between supporting the Okinawa invasion and carrier strikes on the Japanese home islands before being dispatched to Pearl Harbor in early July for an overhaul, which is where she was when the war ended. Baltimore subsequently conducted 3 magic carpet voyages between Pearl Harbor and the West Coast in the months after hostilities ended. Then, on November 10th, she got underway for Japan and remained there through the end of the year. On April 29, 1947, she was decommissioned and placed in the Pacific Reserve Fleet at Bremerton, Washington. With the drums of war beating once more, Baltimore was recommissioned at the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard on November 28, 1951, with Captain Fonville L. Tedder in command. But, instead of heading to the Western Pacific, she prepared for her first deployment to European waters. Take note of the day that she was recommissioned, because according to the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea, they sank Baltimore on July 2, 1950 off the coast of South Korea during the Battle of Chumonshin-chan. They even have an exhibit in their Victorious War Museum in Pyongyang, North Korea, that displays the torpedo boat that supposedly pulled this feat off. Obviously, this is nothing more than commie propaganda, as Baltimore was still in the reserve fleet at Bremerton and did not return to the Far East until 1955. The actual battle involved the light cruiser USS Juneau, the Royal Navy sloop HMS Black Swan, and light cruiser HMS Jamaica. Together, they destroyed several North Korean motor torpedo boats without loss or damage to themselves. In April of 1952, Baltimore commenced operations with the U.S. Sixth Fleet. Over the next 5 months, she traversed the Mediterranean from Gibraltar to Istanbul until being relieved by her sister Columbus in late October. Baltimore returned to the Mediterranean the following spring. After visiting Cagliari, Marseille, and Gulf Juan, she sailed for England, where she represented the United States Navy at Queen Elizabeth II's coronation review off Spithead. She returned to the Mediterranean afterwards, where she resumed her rigorous schedule of operations with the Sixth Fleet. In 1954, Baltimore made her 3rd Mediterranean deployment. Her ports of call on this deployment included new cities such as Barcelona and Oran. Late that summer, she visited England and the Scandinavian ports of Stockholm, Copenhagen, and Oslo before returning to the U.S. That deployment proved to be her last to the Mediterranean, as she was reassigned to the Pacific Fleet in early 1955. After reaching Pearl Harbor on Valentine's Day, she headed for the Western Pacific, where she was assigned to the U.S. Seventh Fleet. After spending the spring and summer months operating with 7th Fleet, she headed for the West Coast, and by January of 1956, she was preparing once more for inactivation. Baltimore rejoined the Pacific Reserve Fleet after being decommissioned on the last day of May 1956. A third call to duty never came. The cost of activating, repairing, and modernizing the ship was deemed to be too much. She remained in the Reserve Fleet for almost a quarter of a century. Her name was finally struck from the Naval Vessel Registry in February of 1971, and she was sold to Zadell Explorations of Portland, Oregon, a little over a year later. Baltimore was released from naval custody on July 13th of the same year and scrapped soon thereafter. Baltimore received 9 battle stars for her World War II service. If you made it this far, I greatly appreciate it. If you're a fan of what I do here, please think about subscribing to the channel and possibly even becoming a channel member. Some of the perks that come with it are early access to my videos and members-only shorts, but please don't feel pressured or anything. Once again, thank you, and I'll see you in the next video.